The transport shuttle's engines hummed with a frequency that made Zeftar's secondary nerve clusters ache. Through the reinforced viewport, the human military installation grew larger against the backdrop of Kepler 442b's rust-colored surface. The Valix observer adjusted his recording equipment with 4 of his 6 manipulator appendages while his primary consciousness focused on the briefing data scrolling across his neural interface. Humans. Such a peculiar species. In the 3 standard cycles since their emergence onto the galactic stage, they had managed to both fascinate and concern the galactic consortium of civilized worlds. Their rapid technological advancement was impressive, certainly, but it was their approach to warfare that had prompted this observation mission. Zeftar had observed 17 different species in combat over his career as a military analyst for the Valix Documentation Corps. From the methodical siege warfare of the crystalline Thekari to the swarm tactics of the insectoid Zelthrin, he had seen every conceivable approach to organized violence. Each species fought according to their nature, their evolution, their fundamental understanding of conflict. It was predictable, scientific, rational. The reports about humans suggested something different. The shuttle touched down on landing platform 7 with barely perceptible contact. Human engineering, Zeftar noted with professional appreciation. Their gravitational dampeners were more sophisticated than anything the Valix had developed, despite being centuries behind in most other technologies. It was one of many contradictions that made humanity so intriguing to study. Commander Elena Vasquez was waiting for him at the airlock. Tall even by human standards, with the characteristic bilateral symmetry and single-head configuration of her species, she wore the dark blue uniform of the Terran Defense Force. Her facial expression was neutral, but Zeftar's emotion reading sensors detected underlying tension. "Observer Zeftar," she said, extending her right manipulator appendage in the human gesture of greeting. "Welcome to Forward Base Titan." Zeftar carefully adjusted his vocal synthesizer to produce sounds within human hearing range. "Commander Vasquez, I appreciate your cooperation with this documentation mission. The consortium is eager to understand human military doctrine." She smiled, though the emotion beneath it registered as complex mixture of amusement and something darker. "I hope you brought strong recording equipment, observer. Tomorrow's operation is going to be unlike anything in your files." As they walked through the base's corridors, Zeftar was struck by the human approach to military architecture. Where other species prioritized either maximum efficiency or intimidating displays of power, humans had somehow managed both while adding elements that served no apparent tactical purpose. Artwork decorated the walls. Small alcoves contained what appeared to be recreational items. The lighting was warm and varied, creating an almost domestic atmosphere. "Your base design is unique," Zeftar commented, his sensors recording everything. "Humans fight better when they feel human," Commander Vasquez replied. "Strip away everything that makes us who we are, and you just have biological weapons. We've learned that's not nearly as effective as soldiers who remember what they're fighting for." They entered the main briefing chamber, where dozens of humans were gathered around a holographic display showing the local star system. Zeftar immediately noticed something that would have been impossible in any other military structure he had observed: the complete absence of rigid hierarchy indicators. Humans of obviously different ranks were engaged in animated discussions, questioning strategies, proposing alternatives. It should have been chaos. Instead, it was the most efficiently organized planning session he had ever witnessed. "The Krextai Empire has established a foothold on Kepler 442c, Commander Vasquez explained, highlighting the third planet in the system. 3 million civilian refugees from the outer colonies are trapped there. Our job is to break the Krextai siege and evacuate the civilians before their reinforcement fleet arrives." Zeftar studied the tactical display with growing confusion. The Krextai held overwhelming numerical superiority, better positioning, and superior firepower. They had fortified their positions on the planet's surface and established orbital supremacy with a battle fleet that outmassed the human force by nearly 4-1. By any rational military analysis, the humans were looking at a mission with less than 5% probability of success. Yet every human in the room was discussing not whether they would succeed, but how they would succeed. "Observer," a young human female approached him. Her rank insignia indicated she was barely above entry level, yet she spoke with confidence that would have been shocking in any other military structure. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Chan, Tactical Analysis. I wanted to make sure you understand what you're going to see tomorrow." I have studied preliminary reports on human combat behavior, Zeftar replied. Though I confess some confusion about your tactical approach to this particular scenario. Lieutenant Chen's expression shifted to something that made Zeftar's threat assessment systems trigger warning signals. The reports don't really capture it, she said quietly. When humans are fighting to save civilians, especially children, we stop following normal rules. Not just military rules. Biological rules. Physical rules. We become something else. Before Zeftar could ask for clarification, alarms began sounding throughout the base. The humans moved with sudden, coordinated precision that transformed the casual atmosphere into something intense and focused. Within moments, the briefing room was empty except for Zeftar and Commander Vasquez. Krextai scout ships have detected our presence, she explained, reading data from a portable display. They're accelerating their timeline. The assault on the refugee camps begins in 6 hours instead of the planned 12. Zeftar watched her face as she processed this information. In any other species, such a development would have triggered fear responses, stress indicators, or at minimum increased aggression hormones. His sensors detected none of these in Commander Vasquez. Instead, he registered something that shouldn't have been possible: anticipation. This changes your tactical situation significantly, he observed. It changes everything, she agreed. And nothing. We were planning to save 3 million people tomorrow. Now we're going to save 3 million people today. The timeline is different. The outcome isn't. She began walking toward what Zeftar's database identified as the armory section. Observer, I need to ask you something, and I need a completely honest answer. In all your documentation of military conflicts, have you ever seen a species fight a battle they knew they couldn't win? Zeftar considered the question carefully. Desperate final stands, yes. Holding actions to buy time for evacuation, certainly. But, deliberately engaging in combat with no probability of tactical success? No. Such behavior would contradict basic survival instincts. Commander Vasquez stopped walking and turned to face him directly. Her facial expression was perfectly calm, but every one of Zeftar's sensors was suddenly registering alarm signals he had never encountered before. That's what I was afraid of, she said. Observer Zeftar, you're about to document something that's never been properly recorded before. When humans fight for something more important than their own survival, we don't just ignore the odds. We don't just overcome impossible situations. We break reality. The armory doors opened to reveal something that made Zeftar's logical processing system struggle to function. The humans were not selecting standard combat equipment. They were choosing weapons and gear that appeared to be designed for scenarios far beyond the current mission parameters. Items that suggested they were preparing for battles that hadn't happened yet, against enemies they hadn't identified, in conditions that didn't currently exist. What are you preparing for? Zeftar asked, though his vocalization systems made the question sound more like an electronic whine. Everything, Commander Vasquez replied simply. When you're fighting to save civilians, you prepare for everything. Because if you miss even one possibility, people die. Children die. And humans who fail to save children become something the galaxy has never seen before. A young human male approached, carrying equipment that Zeftar's database couldn't identify. Commander, the probability matrices are ready. We've calculated outcomes for every possible Krextai response pattern. And, she asked. Successful evacuation probability holding steady at 97.4%. Zeftar's recording systems automatically flagged this as a data error. Based on every mathematical model he could access, the mission success probability was less than 5%. Yet the human's biometric readings indicated complete confidence in his analysis. How is that calculation possible? Zeftar asked. The young human smiled, and Zeftar's threat assessment systems immediately elevated their alert status to maximum. Because we're not calculating the probability that we can save everyone using normal tactics. We're calculating the probability that we can save everyone using any tactics necessary. The distinction being? Normal tactics assume you're willing to fail if the cost becomes too high, Commander Vasquez explained. Human tactics when civilians are at risk assume failure is not an option, regardless of cost. The base's communication system crackled to life with an announcement that made every human in the armory suddenly stop moving. All personnel, this is Base Command. We have received confirmation that approximately 40,000 of the refugees on Kepler 442c are children under the age of 12. Repeat, 40,000 children. The change in the humans was immediate and disturbing. Their biometric readings shifted into patterns Zeftar had never observed in any species. Heart rates increased but stabilized at levels that should have indicated stress, yet their emotional states remained perfectly controlled. Muscle tension increased to combat readiness without any triggering stimuli. Most disturbing, their brain activity patterns shifted into configurations that resembled what Zeftar had previously observed only in predator species during hunting frenzies. Observer, Commander Vasquez said, her voice carrying a quality that made his audio processors struggle with interpretation. I strongly recommend you stay in the command center tomorrow. Record everything, but do not attempt to accompany frontline units. I have observed combat operations for many species without incident, Zeftar replied. Surely human battlefield behavior cannot be more dangerous than Zelfran swarm attacks or Thekhari siege bombardments. Every human within hearing range turned to look at him. Their facial expressions were perfectly neutral, but Zeftar's sensors detected something underneath that made his basic survival programming begin automatic shutdown procedures. Observer, Lieutenant Chen said quietly, when humans are fighting to save children, we don't just become more dangerous than other species. We become more dangerous than physics allows. Tomorrow, you're going to see us prove that impossible is just another word for hasn't happened yet. The humans returned to their preparations with mechanical efficiency that somehow managed to be both perfectly coordinated and deeply unsettling. Zeftar found himself retreating to his assigned quarters, his recording systems automatically archiving everything he had observed while his analytical subroutines struggled to process data that contradicted fundamental assumptions about biological limitations. As he settled into his rest cycle, Zeftar reviewed the day's recordings and tried to understand what he had witnessed. The humans were preparing for a mission that every tactical analysis indicated was impossible. They were approaching it with confidence that bordered on delusion. Their biological responses suggested they were entering a state of controlled hysteria focused entirely on protecting civilians they had never met. By every standard of rational military doctrine, they were exhibiting the behavior patterns of a species in the final stages of psychological collapse. Yet somehow, Zeftar found himself believing they would succeed. Not hoping they would succeed, not calculating improved probability matrices, but experiencing something his species had no word for, faith in beings that refused to accept limitations. Tomorrow, he would observe humans in battle. Tonight, for the first time in his career, he found himself afraid of what he might record. The attack began before dawn, and Zeftar immediately understood why Commander Vasquez had recommended he remain in the command center. Through the sensor feeds streaming into the main tactical display, he watched humanity transform into something that challenged his understanding of biological possibility. The first wave of human fighters approached the Kreksti orbital defenses in vessels that appeared to be standard assault craft. Zeftar's preliminary analysis suggested they were following conventional attack patterns, perhaps with minor tactical innovations. He was wrong. Eagle Squadron, you are cleared for Maneuver 7, came the calm voice of Flight Controller Martinez over the communications channel. Zeftar's database had no reference for Maneuver 7. He watched as the human fighters suddenly broke formation and began flying in patterns that his physics subroutines flagged as impossible. They were pulling gravitational turns that should have liquefied their internal organs, executing acceleration patterns that should have torn their vessels apart, and somehow maintaining formation coherence while operating outside the normal parameters of three-dimensional space. How are they surviving those maneuvers? Zeftar asked the nearest human technician. We redesigned the inertial dampeners based on theoretical physics instead of practical limitations, the technician replied without looking away from her monitoring station. Turns out when you're willing to accept that some of your pilots might die from the equipment working perfectly, you can push performance beyond what anyone thought possible. On the tactical display, Zeftar watched the impossible become routine. Human fighters were appearing inside Kreksti defensive formations through methods that his sensors couldn't track. They were targeting critical systems with precision that suggested they somehow knew the internal layout of enemy vessels they had never encountered before. Most disturbing, they were coordinating their attacks through what appeared to be shared consciousness rather than communication channels. Contact, called out Lieutenant Morrison from the sensor station. Kreksti fleet is launching their entire fighter complement. 240 craft incoming. The human response was immediate and incomprehensible. Instead of calling for reinforcements or adjusting defensive positions, Commander Vasquez simply said, "Tiger Squadron, implement Protocol Shepherd." Zefdar watched 12 human fighters accelerate directly toward an enemy force 20 times their number. His predictive algorithms immediately calculated their destruction within minutes. Instead, something happened that made his recording systems automatically flag the data as corrupted. The human fighters didn't engage the Krextai in conventional combat. They somehow convinced the enemy pilots to turn on each other. "Explain this phenomenon," Zefdar demanded, his vocal systems producing distorted sounds as his logical processes struggled with what he was observing. "Psychological warfare," replied Communications Officer Davis. "Humans have spent thousands of years learning how to make other beings want to kill each other. When the alternative is letting children die, we use every single technique we've ever developed." Through the sensor feeds, Zefdar observed something that violated every principle of military engagement he had ever documented. The Krextai fighters were destroying each other in what appeared to be organized fratricide while the human pilots transmitted signals that his analysis systems couldn't decode. Within 10 minutes, 160 Krextai fighters had been eliminated without the humans firing a single shot. "This is impossible," Zefdar stated, though his voice synthesizer made it sound more like a mechanical shriek. "No," Commander Vasquez corrected, "this is Tuesday. When humans fight for civilians, impossible just means we haven't done it yet today." The ground assault phase began with what appeared to be a standard orbital bombardment pattern. Zefdar's sensors detected human ships positioning themselves for conventional artillery support of surface forces. Again, he was catastrophically wrong. "Ground control, this is orbital command. Initiating terrain modification protocols." Zefdar watched in bewilderment as human bombardment systems began reshaping the planet's surface in real time. They weren't destroying Krextai fortifications. They were moving them. Entire defensive complexes were being relocated to positions that favored human assault tactics, while the landscape around civilian holding areas was being restructured to provide maximum protection from enemy fire. "You're terraforming a planet during active combat operations," Zefdar observed, his recording systems struggling to categorize what he was witnessing. "We're creating the battlefield we need to save 40,000 children," replied Orbital Weapons Coordinator Jackson. "The Krextai built their defenses assuming normal physics would apply. We're operating under the assumption that physics is just another tactical limitation to overcome." The surface assault began with human forces doing something Zefdar had never seen in any military operation. They divided their attention equally between attacking the enemy and protecting civilians. Not protecting their own civilians behind safe lines, but actively shielding enemy non-combatants who happened to be in the combat zone. Through the ground sensor feeds, he watched human soldiers engaging Krextai forces while simultaneously providing medical aid to wounded enemy civilians, sharing their rations with non-combatant refugees of multiple species, and establishing evacuation corridors for anyone who wasn't actively shooting at them. "This tactical approach contradicts basic military doctrine," Zefdar noted. "You are compromising operational effectiveness to protect beings who have no strategic value to your mission." Sergeant Williams, monitoring the ground operations feeds, turned to face him with an expression that made Zefdar's survival systems activate emergency protocols. "Observer, when humans see children in danger, species doesn't matter. Strategic value doesn't matter. If you're small and scared and someone is trying to hurt you, you're automatically under human protection. Anyone who wants to harm a child has to go through every human in the area first." The tactical feed showed exactly that principle in action. Human soldiers were creating protective formations around any group that included children, regardless of whether those children were human, Krextai, or the 17 other species that had been caught in the conflict zone. They were taking wounds to protect beings they couldn't communicate with, sharing critical supplies with refugees who might have been shooting at them an hour earlier, and somehow maintaining offensive operations while running what appeared to be a full-scale humanitarian relief effort. "Incoming transmission from the Krextai ground commander," announced Communications Officer Davis. The holographic display activated to show a heavily armored Krextai military leader. Through his translation systems, Zefdar could understand the alien's words, though the emotional context was lost in transmission lag. "Human forces, this is Commander Thekvas of the 47th Imperial Guard. Your tactical behavior is incomprehensible. You are compromising your operational advantages to protect non-combatant civilians of multiple species, including our own. Explain your strategic objective." Commander Vasquez stepped forward to respond, and Zeftar noted that her biometric readings remained completely stable despite being in command of an operation that should have been overwhelming any biological nervous system. Commander Thekvas, our strategic objective is simple: everyone goes home. Your soldiers go home. Your civilians go home. Our people go home. The refugees go home. The children definitely go home. Anyone who tries to prevent that from happening will be removed from the equation. The Krextai commander's response took several seconds, suggesting he was consulting with his staff. When he responded, his vocal patterns indicated confusion that transcended language barriers. Human commander, your approach to warfare violates established protocols for military engagement. You are protecting our civilians more effectively than we are. Your soldiers are providing better medical care to our wounded than our own medics. This is not logical behavior for an enemy force. Commander, Vasquez replied, we're not your enemies. We're just here to collect some refugees and make sure everyone's children are safe. If you want to fight us while we do that, we'll fight you. If you want to help us do that, we'll work together. If you want to stay out of the way while we do that, we'll ignore you. The choice is entirely yours. Zeftar watched the Krextai commander process this information while simultaneously monitoring the tactical feeds showing human forces continuing their impossible operations. They were advancing on all fronts while somehow managing to improve conditions for every civilian in the combat zone. They were defeating enemy forces while providing those same forces with better equipment than they had started with. They were winning a war while accidentally creating the conditions for a lasting peace. This is a practical demonstration of human military doctrine? Zeftar asked, though his voice systems produced sounds that resembled mechanical distress calls. This is a practical demonstration of what happens when you threaten human children, Commander Vasquez replied. Or any children when humans are in the area. We don't have a special tactical doctrine for these situations. We just remove every obstacle between the children and safety. Physical obstacles, enemy forces, planetary gravitational fields, the speed of light, mathematical impossibilities, whatever. The children go home. Everything else is just details. The tactical situation evolved in ways that Zeftar's predictive systems had never been designed to handle. Human forces were simultaneously winning decisive victories against superior enemy numbers, providing humanitarian aid to multiple species, conducting large-scale evacuation operations, and somehow managing to make the Krextai ground forces increasingly confused about whether they were supposed to be fighting the humans or asking them for assistance. Ground control, this is Alpha Team, came the voice of a human field commander through the communication system. We've secured Refugee Camp 7, but we have a situation. The Krextai defenders surrendered, but they're asking if they can help with the evacuation operations. Their children are scared, and they want to make sure the human soldiers will protect them too. Tell them yes, Commander Vasquez responded immediately. Anyone who wants to help get children to safety is temporarily part of human forces, regardless of what uniform they're wearing. Zeftar's logical systems flagged this as a complete breakdown of military protocol. The humans were accepting enemy soldiers into their operational structure based solely on their willingness to help protect civilians. It should have created chaos, confusion, and tactical vulnerability. Instead, it created the most efficient humanitarian operation he had ever observed, with former enemies working together as if they had trained together for years. Observer, Lieutenant Chen approached him with a data tablet showing real-time casualty reports. I thought you might want to see this. Zeftar examined the data and immediately assumed his recording systems had malfunctioned. According to the reports, human casualties were running at 12% of projected levels, civilian casualties were approaching zero, and enemy casualties were somehow lower than if no combat operations had been conducted at all. These figures cannot be accurate, he stated. They're accurate, Lieutenant Chen confirmed. When humans fight to protect children, reality adjusts to accommodate our objectives. We don't overcome impossible odds. We make it impossible for children to be hurt, and then work backward from there to figure out what tactics are necessary to achieve that result. Through the tactical displays, Zeftar observed the final phases of operations that redefined his understanding of what warfare could accomplish. The humans had not only successfully evacuated all civilian refugees, but had somehow managed to evacuate several thousand Krextai non-combatants whose existence hadn't been detected until human forces started actively protecting them. More disturbing from a purely military analysis perspective, they had converted approximately 60% of the enemy ground forces to volunteer assistance in the evacuation operation simply by demonstrating their commitment to protecting everyone's children equally. The Krextai orbital fleet was requesting permission to surrender. Not because they had been defeated, but because they wanted to ensure their families would receive the same protection the humans had provided to everyone else. Zeftar found himself staring at tactical displays that showed impossible results achieved through methods that violated fundamental military principles. The humans had won a war by making everyone involved realize they cared more about protecting each other's children than continuing to fight. What Zeftar witnessed in the following hours fundamentally altered his understanding of what biological entities could accomplish when operating outside the boundaries of rational limitation. The evacuation operation had succeeded beyond any mathematical possibility, but the humans were not finished. They were escalating. Observer, Commander Vasquez approached his monitoring station, her biometric readings showing patterns he was beginning to recognize as distinctly human, complete calm overlaying absolute determination. We have a complication that requires documentation. 3 Krextai children were separated from their family groups during the initial phases of our operation. They are currently hiding somewhere in the ruins of Industrial Complex 15, approximately 40 kilometers behind what used to be enemy lines. Zeftar processed this information through standard tactical analysis protocols. The logical approach would be to include these 3 individuals in post-conflict casualty assessments. The resources required to locate and extract 3 civilians from a dangerous area cannot be justified against potential human losses. The change in every human within hearing range was immediate and deeply disturbing. Their collective biometric readings shifted into patterns that Zeftar's database identified as associated with predatory species preparing to eliminate existential threats. But humans were not predators. They were omnivorous social creatures with complex ethical frameworks that should have prevented such responses. Observer, Lieutenant Chen said quietly, her vocal patterns carrying harmonics that made his audio systems register automatic warnings. You just suggested that we should write off 3 children because the math doesn't work. I need you to understand what you've accidentally recommended. Before Zeftar could respond, alarms throughout the command center began sounding patterns he had never heard before. These were not standard military alerts. These were sounds designed to inform everyone within range that human forces were transitioning to operational modes that existed beyond normal tactical parameters. All stations, this is Commander Vasquez. We have 3 Krextai children, estimated ages 4 to 7 standard years, trapped in hostile territory. Initiate Protocol Sanctuary. Repeat, initiate Protocol Sanctuary. The transformation was immediate. Humans throughout the command center began accessing equipment and systems that had not been active during the previous operations. Zeftar's sensors detected energy signatures and technological activations that suggested capabilities far beyond what any military force should have possessed. What is Protocol Sanctuary? He asked, though his vocal synthesizer produced the question as a series of mechanical whines that indicated system stress. Protocol Sanctuary is what happens when human children are in immediate danger and conventional rescue operations are insufficient, replied Tactical Coordinator Kim. It means we stop pretending that physics, mathematics, enemy resistance, or our own safety limitations are relevant factors in the decision-making process. On the main tactical display, Zeftar watched something that made his recording systems automatically begin archiving everything to multiple backup storage arrays. Human forces were reconfiguring themselves into assault formations that appeared to be designed for scenarios involving significantly larger enemies and dramatically different environmental conditions than currently existed. Orbital Command, this is Ground Control. Deploy the Lighthouse Array for precision operations. Confirmed, Ground Control. Lighthouse Array deploying in 30 seconds. Zeftar had no reference for Lighthouse Array in any human military database he had access to. Through the orbital sensor feeds, he observed human spacecraft positioning themselves in a complex formation around the planet. They were not preparing for bombardment operations or orbital support. They were creating something that his sensors identified as a localized gravitational manipulation field spanning several thousand cubic kilometers of space. You are altering the fundamental forces affecting an entire region of the planet, Zeftar observed, his logical processes struggling to categorize this level of technological capability. We are creating an environment where 3 children cannot be harmed by any factor currently present in their vicinity, replied Orbital Operations Director Park. Standard rescue protocols were designed for situations where acceptable losses might include the people you're trying to save. Protocol Sanctuary operates under the assumption that acceptable losses never include children, regardless of what modifications to local reality are necessary to ensure their safety. The gravitational modifications were only the beginning. Through sensor feeds, Zeftar watched human forces deploy technologies that appeared to exist several centuries beyond anything they had demonstrated during the previous combat operations. They were using equipment that seemed to manipulate matter at the molecular level, energy systems that operated outside conventional power limitations, and coordination systems that enabled thousands of individuals to function as a single, perfectly efficient organism. Ground teams Alpha through Omega, you are cleared for enhanced operations. Environmental controls are active. Physics modifications are stable. Proceed with child recovery. Zeftar observed the most disturbing military operation in his career as a documentation specialist. Human soldiers were moving through the industrial complex using methods that violated basic principles of matter and energy. They were walking through solid barriers as if they didn't exist. They were covering distances in timeframes that contradicted his understanding of space and velocity. They were accessing information about their environment that they had no technological means of obtaining. Most unsettling, they were doing all of this while maintaining perfect coordination and somehow managing to improve environmental conditions for every life form in their vicinity. Plants were growing faster in areas where human soldiers had passed. The local atmosphere was becoming more breathable for multiple species simultaneously. Even microbial life was showing increased health and reproduction rates. How are your soldiers accomplishing these modifications to local conditions? Zeftar asked, his voice systems producing sounds that resembled mechanical panic. When humans are operating under Protocol Sanctuary, we stop accepting the limitations that normally govern biological entities, explained Field Operations Coordinator Yamamoto. Our soldiers are not just people anymore. They are temporarily functioning as extensions of human will applied directly to reality. The universe adjusts to accommodate their absolute requirement that children not be harmed. Through the communication system, Zeftar heard the voice of Sergeant Rodriguez, leader of the primary search team, reporting from inside the industrial complex. Command, we have visual contact with the 3 Krekstei children. They are unharmed but severely traumatized. Beginning approach using Protocol Sanctuary guidelines. Confirmed, Sergeant. Remember that trauma healing is part of the primary objective. These children should be in better psychological condition when we extract them than they were when they became lost. Zeftar watched through Rodriguez's helmet camera as the human sergeant approached 3 small Krekstei children hiding in the wreckage of what appeared to be a collapsed storage facility. The children were exhibiting obvious signs of terror, injury, and exhaustion that should have required extensive medical intervention and psychological counseling to address. Instead, something impossible happened. As Sergeant Rodriguez moved closer to the children, their emotional and physical conditions began improving in real time. Their injuries healed. Their fear responses transformed into curiosity. Their exhaustion was replaced by energy and alertness. Most disturbing, they began exhibiting behavioral patterns that suggested they were somehow understanding human emotional communication despite the complete absence of shared language or cultural context. Explain this phenomenon, Zeftar demanded, his logical systems beginning to show signs of processing overload. Protocol Sanctuary includes automatic optimization of conditions for any children within operational range, replied Medical Coordinator Hassan. When human forces are operating under these parameters, the local environment becomes actively beneficial to child development and emotional health. Fear becomes courage. Pain becomes healing. Confusion becomes understanding. Children cannot be harmed when Protocol Sanctuary is active, but, more importantly, they cannot remain in states that prevent them from being happy and safe. Through Rodriguez's camera, Zeftar observed the Krekstei children beginning to interact with the human soldier as if they had known each other for years. They were following his instructions despite language barriers, trusting his protection despite species differences, and somehow communicating complex emotional states through methods that his sensors couldn't identify. Sergeant Rodriguez to command. The children are secure and ready for extraction. However, we have identified a complication. There are 47 additional life forms in this area that meet Protocol Sanctuary criteria for protection. Mixed species, various ages, all requiring immediate assistance. Confirmed, Sergeant. Expand operational area to include all detected life forms. Protocol Sanctuary applies to everyone who needs it. Zefdar watched his tactical understanding of human military capabilities completely collapse as the rescue operation expanded beyond any rational scope. Human forces were no longer conducting a mission to rescue 3 specific children. They were systematically locating and protecting every vulnerable life form within a constantly expanding operational area. They were not just rescuing individuals who needed help. They were actively improving the lives of everyone they encountered. Former enemies were receiving better medical care than they had access to before the conflict began. Civilians who had been struggling with basic survival were being provided with resources and technologies that would improve their quality of life for years to come. Most disturbing, the humans were somehow managing to convince everyone they helped to cooperate in helping others. The Krextai children were assisting with communications. Former enemy soldiers were volunteering to help locate additional civilians in need. Even non-sentient life forms were actively participating in the operation by providing information about environmental conditions and resource locations. Command, this is Rodriguez. We now have 237 life forms under Protocol Sanctuary protection. The operational area has expanded to include 6 square kilometers of territory. All individuals are secure, healthy, and actively participating in mutual aid operations. Understood, Sergeant. Continue expansion as needed. Protocol Sanctuary has no operational limits when children are involved. Zefdar realized that he was observing something that transcended military operations and approached the level of localized reality modification. The humans were not just rescuing civilians from a dangerous area. They were transforming the dangerous area into a place where being a civilian was actively beneficial. They were converting a post-conflict zone into something that resembled an idealized community center where multiple species could interact safely and productively. The original 3 Krextai children were now leading groups of mixed-species individuals in what appeared to be recreational activities that somehow also functioned as efficiency improvements for the ongoing rescue operations. Former enemies were working together to solve logistical problems. Environmental conditions continued to improve with every human action. Observer, Commander Vasquez approached his station again, her biometric readings now showing patterns that his systems couldn't classify within any known biological parameters. What you are witnessing is why the consortium needs to understand human military capabilities. This is not our maximum operational level. This is what happens when 3 children are in mild danger and we have sufficient resources to respond appropriately. What happens when the danger is severe? Zefdar asked, though his voice systems were producing sounds.